I gazed out at the winding logging trail, my mind flooding with memories of my youth. My dad would drag my sister and me out here, deep into the wilderness to go boondocking, camping off the beaten path, where the only sounds were the trees creaking and the wildlife roaming free. I had fond memories of hiking throughout these woods, exploring the streams and waterfalls, and sleeping underneath the stars. Now I was bringing my own son out here, hoping to recreate those memories and forge new ones. As we turned onto the trail, the trees seemed to close in around us, casting these long, ominous shadows. The air grew thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. My son was excited to be out on his first boondocking trip. He chattered enthusiastically in the passenger seat next to me. His name was Andrew, and at the time he was 13 years old, just going into high school after summer. But as we wound deeper and deeper into those woods, I felt this growing sense of unease. The trail was familiar, but somehow different. And that's when we came around this bend and I saw it. A hulking cell phone tower, its metal latticework looming over the treetops like a giant skeleton. I felt a jolt of shock and almost offense. This monstrosity had been erected in my childhood playground. I glanced over at my son who was staring up at the tower in awe. "Dad, look!" he exclaimed. I forced a smile and just tried to hide my discomfort. "Yeah, buddy, that's quite a structure." We continued on, passing a few campers and RVs, but I just couldn't shake that feeling of annoyance. That tower loomed over us, its presence disrupting the peaceful atmosphere of the woods. I decided to push on, find a spot far away from that tower so that we could still experience the wilderness as it was meant to be. The trail grew rougher, the trees closer together, and the shadows darker. My son's chatter had died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. I could feel his eyes on me, sensing my tension. I tried to reassure him with a smile, but my mind was racing. What was that tower doing out here? Who had erected it and why? What kind of people would camp so close to that kind of monstrosity? The questions swirled around in my head like a vortex, drawing me into a series of dead-end questions. And then just like that, I was over it. The reality was just that my feelings were hurt. I saw that tower and it was like a slight against all the memories that I had with my father and my grandfather out here. Like it somehow overrode them and took them away from me. I just gripped the wheel and pushed deeper into the forest, determined to find a good place to spend the night. As we bumped along the road, the trees seemed to close in around us, air growing thick with this unsettling energy. I knew we had to keep moving, to find a spot where the wilderness was still wild. The memories we would make would be untainted by that looming presence of that tower. So we continued to push deeper and deeper into the woods. We rounded a bend in the trail to find this picturesque meadow unfolding right before us. It was nestled right inside this tranquil valley. The sun lit up the area, illuminating the rolling hills and woodland beyond. I glanced over at Andrew, his eyes wide with excitement, and I knew we'd found our perfect campsite. I parked the truck, helped Andrew gather firewood before I set up the tent. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the occasional bird call or rustling leaves. As we worked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of nostalgia just wash over me. This was what boondocking was all about, escaping the hustle and bustle, reconnecting with nature, and sharing it with the next generation. With camp now set up, we decided to take a short hike to get our bearings. The dry creek bed nearby offered a natural path, winding its way through the hills and woodland. We followed it, our footsteps echoing off the trees until it intersected with a serene lake. The water sparkled in the fading light, and I felt that sudden jolt of recognition. "Andrew, I remember this lake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I came here with your grandfather oh so many years ago." Andrew's eyes lit up. "Is there fish in there, Dad?" I smiled. "Lots and lots of trout, son. This lake is a hidden gem. Not many people even know it's back here." As we scanned the shores, I noticed something odd. There wasn't a single fisherman in sight. The lake was untouched, pristine. Andrew then asked if he could fish, and I agreed, but told him that we have to do it tomorrow. He nodded, his face aglow with excitement. As we headed back to camp, The sun dipped down below the horizon, casting the meadow in a warm orange glow. We spent the evening swapping stories, watching the stars twinkle above to life. The fire crackled. The smell of hot dogs and beans filled the air. Andrew chattered about his school year, his eyes sparkling with wonder. I listened with my heart full of pride and nostalgia. We settled in for the night, the darkness pressing in around us. I focused on the peacefulness around us in the moment. I think everyone has that feeling when they go camping, though. To feel unprotected, unshielded out in the darkness of the wild that lends to the natural vulnerability. It's probably human to feel instinctual fear deep inside our bellies when we look out into the night. Soon, though, we said goodnight to one another and then went off to bed. As I drifted off to sleep, the sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl lulled me back into that sense of security. I passed out and got some of the best sleep of my life that night. The morning crept over the hills, casting a warm glow over our campsite. I stirred the embers of last night's fire, adding fresh kindling to coax the flames back to life. Andrew emerged from the tent, rubbing his sleep from his eyes, and we set about making breakfast. The sizzle of bacon and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee quickly filled the air, and my stomach growled in anticipation. After breakfast, we set up this makeshift archery range, our targets pinned to a tree about 30 yards away. Andrew and I took turns shooting, our bows creaking as we loosed arrow after arrow. The thud of the arrows hitting the target was very satisfying, and we spent the morning lost in the rhythm of shooting and retrieving. This was a new pastime, not something I ever did with my father. It was cool to be forging those new memories with my son. Next, we laced up our hiking boots, tackled the highest hill in the area. The climb itself was grueling, but the view from the top was breathtaking. We sat on a rocky outcropping, our legs dangling over the edge, gazed out at the rolling hills and woodland below. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers. By the time we returned to camp, the sun was high overhead, and I was exhausted. Andrew, on the other hand, was still raring to go. "Hey Dad, can we go fishing now?" he asked, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. I smiled and was happy to oblige him. "Sure thing, kiddo, just be careful and don't go too far." I helped him gather his gear and he set off towards the lake, his rod in one hand and tackle box slung over his shoulder. I watched him go, feeling a sense of pride and nostalgia wash over me. My little boy was growing up, becoming more and more independent by the day. Reminded me of me every trip I ever took with my old man, waiting for the right time to sneak off and explore alone, feel that weight of becoming a man. As soon as Andrew disappeared from view, I crawled into the tent, my eyes heavy with fatigue. I collapsed into my sleeping bag, feeling the softness envelop me. The sound of birdsong and rustling leaves lulled me into a deep sleep. As I drifted off, though, a feeling of unease quickly came over me. The woods seemed quieter than usual, the silence almost oppressive. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I was just tired and I needed to get over it. But deep down, I knew better. The wilderness was full of secrets. I had a feeling we were about to uncover one. Then something woke me up. I wasn't sure what at first, but it was very loud and very abrupt. A shrill sound of some sort. I snapped awake, disoriented, unsure of where I was or what even time it was. The still blueness beyond the nylon of the tent told me that the sun was going down, and as I unzipped the door, I found that to be correct. Andrew was nowhere to be seen, and a panic quickly rised up inside me. I tried to calm myself down, reminding myself that he's handy and capable. He has a flashlight, a small first aid kit, even a pocket knife. He'd take care of himself for a couple of hours. As I exited the tent, I started getting camp together, splitting kindling, getting the fire going, and prepping dinner. But as the time wore on, the forest got darker and darker, and I started to worry again, worrying about my son. I looked over in the direction of the lake and heard that same shrill sound again, a deafening shriek from the same direction. It was a little higher up the hill. It almost sounded like a woman screaming, but after another shriek, I placed it for what it actually was, a mountain lion. They have this incredibly shrill sound that they make, and for a moment, I was petrified. I know Andrew was probably on his way back. I realized he could confuse the sound for a woman screaming, maybe go into the woods for help, which could be fatal. I grabbed my flashlight and my pistol and began the jaunt over to the lake, all while hearing that mountain lion shriek. Soon the water comes into view, just as the last of the sunlight is disappearing, and I can make out Andrew on the far side, getting ready to march out into the woodland. On my side of the lake is all his fishing gear, but across the water, all I can see is his back. He was looking up into the trees, up that hillside, for any sign of what was making the sound. It had lured him all the way around the far side of the lake, and was now coaxing him into the darkness, into whatever trap that animal had set. I screamed for him to stop, and just in time too, then instructed him to come over to me. He jumped, turned, and then slowly started making his way back over. It took him a while, a good 20 minutes or so, to hopscotch the rocks and shoreline, but he finally made it, intact. Thank God. What the hell were you doing? Andrew admitted he thought those sounds were that of a distressed woman, and I'm beyond relieved that I prevented such a fatal mistake. I explained to him the dangers of the predators in the wild, and we spent the night listening to coyotes and owls, sometimes that mountain lion, until we both slipped off to sleep. Andrew didn't catch any fish, but he did learn a great deal about survival. By the next morning, the area was thick with law enforcement, forest rangers as well, even some game and fish wardens. There was a mountain lion attack during the night, right inside someone's camp, where a man was attacked and his dog was killed. Andrew and I are blown away by our good fortune, decided not to risk our luck for another night. We packed up camp and our senses still on high alert, made our way back down the mountain, grateful to escape the clutches of that mountain lion's deadly claws. During the long weekends and right seasons, my favorite pastime is through hiking. Some people call it backpacking, but I like to call it conquering long established distances. Examples of this would be the Appalachian Trail or the Arizona Trail, both of which can take months to fully complete, end to end. These are daydream hikes for me, as the excursions I map out are anywhere from 20 to 40 miles and only take 2 to 4 days. This is because I like to hike alone pretty much in deep wilderness, well away from civilization. I overnight camp wherever the trail leaves me, then I pick up where I left off in the morning. My story is about a time I was doing a through hike in an area familiar to me. In fact, it was one of my favorite places for a quick turnaround trip. It's beautiful, it's jagged, and the people stick to the main draws and paths, so it's easy to leave them behind. I drove out to the trailhead, parked my truck, and spent some time making sure that I had everything packed up. There is nothing worse than getting out on the trail, putting a few hours between you and your vehicle, only to realize you forgot matches or my reading book in the glove box. There is no turning around, I just have to make do with whatever I might have forgotten. After ensuring everything was secured, I shouldered my pack, the weight feeling familiar and comforting, then set off from the trailhead with a sense of excitement and anticipation. 2 days, I'd be finished with this section of the trail. I've done this before, many times. There's something special about this particular stretch. Maybe it was the promise of solitude, or the challenge of the terrain. Whatever it was, I was ready for it. The first few hours fly by in a blur of sweat and exertion. I hiked with purpose, my boots eating up the miles as I wound my way through the trees. The sun beat down on me, warming my skin and casting its dappled shadows on the ground. As I passed other hikers, backpackers, and day trippers, I exchanged nods with pleasantries as we crossed our paths. The trail was well worn, and I knew I wasn't alone out here. As that day wore on though, the crowd started to thin out. I found myself completely alone out there on the trail. The trees grew closer together, the canopy overhead a vibrant green. I heard the burble of a stream up ahead, and then followed the sound to a picturesque clearing. Fishermen dotted the banks, their lines cast out into the water. I watched for a moment, mesmerized by the gentle ripples on the surface. As I continued on, the trail led me higher and higher into the mountains. The air grew cooler, the trees more sparse. I could feel the weight of my pack digging into my shoulders, but I pressed on, driven by the sense of determination. Finally, after hours of climbing, I crested a ridge and found myself in this stunning clearing. The sun was still high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the scene before me. I dropped my pack to the ground, just relieved to be free of its burden for a moment, then took a moment to soak it all in. The clearing itself was a natural amphitheater, surrounded by towering trees and a ring of boulders. A small stream ran through the center, its source and destination unknown to me. I explored the area. My boots were quiet on the soft earth. The air was filled with the sweet scent of wildflowers, and I felt a sense of peace wash right over me. This was exactly why I made these trips for, a therapy for my body, mind, and soul. There wasn't any danger out here. One of my first chores for making up my camp was to clear away a healthy blanket of poison ivy. I keep a knife like most hikers, but I also carry a decent-sized machete, strapped to the exterior of my pack. It's good at angles that I can't reach, without taking the straps off. I used it to whack away the poison ivy, keep the area clear of any potential rashes. As I made my way back to my pack, I noticed something odd, a piece of fabric caught in the bush. I walked over to investigate, my mind already turning over any possibilities. It was definitely a piece of cloth, but it was torn and frayed. It looked old, like it'd been here for a really long time. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just some leftover from any previous hiker. But as I set up my campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was now being watched. I looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just trees, rocks, and the quiet of the wilderness. I gathered firewood, reset the stones around the pit, then set up my single-person tent, and then a stump to sit on. I even whittled a spear, tried my hand at fishing in the stream later. I settled in for the night, my fire crackling and spitting as I cooked my dinner. The sky was beginning to darken overhead. I felt a sense of contentment wash right over me. This is exactly where I wanted to be. But as I lay there trying to enjoy that sunset, that feeling crept back in, a feeling that I wasn't alone in this clearing. I tried to think back to the last place that I saw anyone, and the only one that I could remember were the fishermen down at the bottom of the hill, a solid 2 miles away and well off the trail. By that, I mean there wasn't any actual path that would lead anyone directly to me. They'd have to follow the glow of the firelight, and even then, that would be very odd behavior for the area that I was in. As night began to fall, I settled in, trying to just relax after that long day of hiking. But the darkness continued to deepen, and I started to hear a strange noise off in the distance. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but the sound grew louder and more persistent. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination playing some kind of trick on me. But as the minutes ticked by, the noise grew louder and more intense. It sounded like someone was hurt or in distress. Now my instincts kicked in, and I knew I needed to investigate. It was like a flapping sound. It's really hard to explain. I wasn't sure if it was an injured hiker or an injured animal, but something was off with what I was hearing. I grabbed my flashlight and set off into the darkness, my heart slamming with anticipation. As I made my way through the trees, I stumbled upon more evidence of recent human activity. More fabric caught in branches, discarded hiking gear, even a recent fire pit. My mind continued to race with possibilities. Was someone injured? Was someone lost? I started to entertain even darker thoughts, like maybe someone was disposing of a body out here. I pushed through a thick patch of trees, my flashlight casting an eerie shadow on the ground. And then that's when I heard it. The sound of voices, panicked and urgent. I rounded a boulder and suddenly found myself face to face with a young couple, naked and intertwined in a passionate embrace. And when I say I rounded the corner and they were there, I mean I almost stepped on them as they were rooting around. I almost bumped into their flesh as they rocked back and forth. To take it a step further, I could literally smell the sex in the air. It was strange and honestly kind of gross. For a moment, we all froze, our eyes locked in a silent understanding. I was the intruder, the unwanted observer. I apologized trying to back away, but they didn't really react well. They both went into a complete panic, but made no effort to dress themselves. I'm sorry, I repeated. I thought someone needed help out here. You're a pervert. How'd you even find us out here, dude? The guy screamed at me. You like sneaking up on people? The girl pressed. You're going to prison. They were up and coming right at me, screaming all types of manner and crazy insults. I had no other option but to keep backing up, try to get away. But as I did, my steps became more and more rapid. I was glad to have my good boots on, with no heavy pack across my back, light and fast, just what I needed to be. Something had obviously snapped inside that couple. They launched themselves at me, rocks and insults flying through the air as they chased me through the forest. And I mean it, they were actually throwing rocks at me. When I saw this, I knew they were crazy and I couldn't let them get any closer. If they were willing to throw rocks, who knew what they would do if they could actually get their hands on me? I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, flashlight casting wild shadows on the trees. I could still feel their rage and anger, their desperation to protect their secret. I knew I was in some kind of danger here. As I stumbled through the underbrush, I could almost feel their breath on my neck, their footsteps closing in, closer and closer. I was all alone, vulnerable, and completely at their mercy. I knew I had to just keep running no matter what lay ahead. I crashed through the forest, my feet pounding against the earth as I desperately tried to escape them. They were gaining ground, their footsteps closing in on me like some kind of predator. I could still feel that rage and that anger, that desperation to catch up. It was such a weird reaction to my accidental intrusion. Any normal person would be embarrassed and try to cover up. It made me wonder what I really discovered out there. Was the girl underage, kidnapped? Who would hike out miles and miles into the middle of nowhere just to have sex? It just seemed very strange. I continued fumbling around in the darkness, my flashlight beam casting these eerie shadows around me. I knew the flashlight was a liability, giving away my position with every step. I needed to get rid of it. I darted around this massive trunk and killed the light, just held my breath. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I could still hear the couple crashing through the underbrush, their footsteps growing louder and louder every passing moment. They were like wild animals, driven by this primal fury. I pressed myself against the tree, my heart racing in my chest. I could almost feel their eyes on me. Slowly, the couple moved off in the direction of my camp, their naked bodies disappearing into the darkness. I let out a sigh of relief, my muscles relaxing ever so slightly. But I knew I couldn't stay here for long. I had to get back to my camp, get my gear, and get the hell out of here before they came back. I continued creeping through the darkness, my senses now on high alert. I could hear the couple's distant shouts, their insults and threats, echoing around the forest. They were still out there, still searching for me, and would continue to do so for many, many hours. This was a crazy, scary experience, and one that stays with me still to this day. Slowly and silently, I left my hiding place, crept back to my camp. There's no one there, no naked assailants waiting for me in the brush. I pocketed my flashlight, grabbed my machete, and proceeded to pack up all my shit as quietly as possible. With shaking hands, I continued to pack, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. I knew I couldn't hike back to the trailhead in the dark, not with those two lunatics on the loose. I had to hide, wait for dawn before I could make any kind of move. I got everything secured, loaded it onto my back once more, and then proceeded back into the forest, away from the sounds of that thrashing couple. I moved up the hillside, my eyes fixed on the rocks above, and tucked myself away into the small crevice, heart pounding in my chest. I could hear their footsteps, their labored breathing, as they stumbled throughout the darkness themselves. They were getting closer still, and their anger and frustration very palpable. I figured that if they caught me, they would try to kill me. Why else would you spend so much time and so much energy hunting someone down? As the night wore on, the shouts grew louder, their insults more vicious. They were out of breath still, scratching and bruised, but they would not give up the chase. I could still see them stumbling around through the darkness, their naked bodies barely illuminated by the faint moonlight. They passed my hiding place more than once actually, their eyes scanning the rocks above me. I held my breath and my heart froze in my chest. They were so close to finding me. I had to stay hidden. I had to wait until dawn before I could make any kind of escape. Thankfully, their shouts grew fainter, their footsteps disappearing into the distance. I let out a sigh of relief, my muscles relaxing ever so slightly. I had made it through the night, but I could not stay here for very long. I had to get out. I had to get back to civilization before those two psychos came after me again. The morning was uneventful, almost to the point I started to think maybe I hallucinated that whole encounter. I remember the clearing that I did of the poison ivy. I wondered if there was another plant mixed in with them, something that might make me hallucinate or something like that, but I couldn't imagine what that would be. I trudged down the hillside until I intersected with the main river and came upon more fishermen. They waved hello and I waved one back, continued on my merry way back to my truck. I never saw that couple again, and I can also tell you that was the only time I didn't finish a through hiking trip. Just too weird and crazy. Too scary to try to push through it after that. I kept my eyes on the papers for anything weird in that area the rest of the year, but never saw really anything reported. Took a few months off and planned more trips in a more remote area, and I never did have anything like that happen to me again. And for that, I'm very thankful. Me and my wife have a mutual love for the outdoors, hiking, backpacking, even kayaking a couple of times. The thing is, we live in the city, so we don't get to do it as much as we want. We both grew up camping, but not living and breathing it for anything. Just got a basic understanding of what it took to get by. When we camp, we like to do it in those designated camping areas like KOAs you see along highways, stuff similar to that. There's an entrance attendant, slotted, numbered camping spots, and usually shared amenities, bathrooms and dumpsters. It's tailored towards city slicker types, but it's what we were comfortable doing. As I turned off the main road and onto the dirt path leading to the campground, a sense of nostalgia just washed right over me. I'd been out here once before, many years ago with my family. It was a summer camping trip. I had a lot of fond memories about hiking through these woods, swimming in the nearby lake, and roasting marshmallows over a campfire. It was cool to be coming back to a place that I'd used to be before. As we drove further down the path, I noticed something was kind of off though. The entrance gate was now gone, and the established part of the campground was abandoned. The gate was wide open. The admittance booth was boarded up. It was like a serious ghost town now. Very ominous and very weird. We continued driving in anyway though. There weren't any keep out signs or anything. It just looked as if money fell through the campsite and it was just left to its own devices. Boondocking, I think it's called. The outbuildings were locked up tight. The area was overgrown with grass and weeds. A sign hung crookedly from a pole reading campground in faded letters. This was it. I just wasn't sure I wanted to be here anymore. Like I said earlier, we're inner city folks. Camping on our own sounds kind of scary more than anything else. Still, I was with my wife and wanted to spend a weekend away with her. Shelby raised an eyebrow as we pulled up into the empty campsite. "Well, this is cozy," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. I shrugged. "It's not that bad. We can still make the most of it." And that's exactly what we did. We set up our tent, secured the area, and collected some firewood. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. As the sun began to set later that night, we got the fire pit mucked out and started a fire, the flames crackling and spitting as we cooked an early dinner. As we sat down to eat, I couldn't shake this feeling that we were being watched. I glanced around, but I never saw anyone, no one in sight. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches creaking ominously in the breeze. I quickly tried to push those thoughts aside and just focus on the peacefulness of the moment. We didn't really eat anything fancy, just some BLT sandwiches and potato chips. As we grazed, we just watched the sun fade away, and it hit me that I was actually thoroughly enjoying this. No barking dogs, no buzzing flies around the trash, no kids running around hooting and hollering. I could actually see why people like to boondock or free camp, whatever it's called. There wasn't a single disturbance for what seemed like forever. As the night wore on, the darkness seemed to press in around us, the fire casting flickering shadows on the trees, making it seem like we were surrounded by shadowy figures. I tried to brush it off as mere paranoia, but the feeling just continued to persist. Eventually it faded away though. All my worries and concerns just seemed to melt away as the time pressed on. There weren't any coyotes prowling, no signs of bears, no signs of anything scary at all. But by the time the moon creeped up high above us, I was totally at peace, teetering on falling asleep. As we settled in for the night, Shelby snuggled up close to me, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. "You know what, this is actually kind of nice," she whispered. "Just us, alone in the woods." I smiled and wrapped my arms around her. "Yeah, it's perfect." That started us down the path of some adult time. Light petting, watering hands, you know what I mean. It was getting hot too, like we'd never gotten physical before. I chalked it up to the dark isolation that we found ourselves in, and surrendered to our more basic instincts. We had our fun and then got inside the tent, back into our sleeping bags and said goodnight. But as I slowly drifted off to sleep, that feeling slowly crept back in, the feeling of not being alone. It came back the second that I laid my head down. I was certain that there was something out there. Whatever it was, just waiting just beyond the campsite, watching us with cold, calculated eyes. I had zero evidence to support any of this, but in my mind's eye, trouble was just not far away. Looking back now, my instincts must have been zeroed in or something, because it turned out I was right. The tranquility of the forest enveloped us, and soon Shelby was snoring next to me. The crackling of the coals and the chirping of the crickets, the gentle whooshing of the wind through the trees, created almost this soothing melody. As I laid there, I let that soothing natural world, coupled with Shelby's light snoring, relax me and whisk me away into dreamland. Just as I closed my eyes for that last time, that peacefulness was shattered by the screaming crank up of an engine firing. The sound tore through the forest like a demon, making both of us jump up. We looked at one another, confused, trying to pinpoint the location of the noise. But the expanse of the forest made it almost impossible to gauge how far away that truck actually was. It continued to crank over and over, until finally roaring to life and screaming throughout the wilderness. It was the worst, most industrial sound that I could imagine in the moment, and my heart beat into a thunderstorm. At first, we just wrote it off as another campground, having a late-night joyride. But as the engine grew closer, the hollering and whooping became louder and louder, and so our concern grew. Shelby then asked a good question, one that sent my mind reeling back into paranoia. "What if it's not just some other campers?" she whispered. I remember all the abandoned stuff that we saw when we pulled in. The creaking sign, the faded paint, the rotting wood. All those locked up buildings stood like prisoners among trees. Could people be squatting out here? It seemed like a true haven for homeless, but again, I had nothing to back up any of these assertions. I tried to reassure her, but my own unease was growing and growing. We were exposed, vulnerable, and isolated. Shelby's panic was contagious, and I could feel my heart racing again. Without a word, I jumped up and pulled my truck around, positioning it to block the firelight from the road. I grabbed some blankets and draped them over the glass, trapping the light and reducing the glow. Shelby watched me, her eyes wide with fear as I doused the flames, careful to not create too much smoke. The darkness now seemed to swallow us whole, and we huddled together, waiting to see if anyone would come down that old camping road into our makeshift campsite. The minutes ticked by, almost feeling like hours, each one stretching out into an eternity. The silence was oppressive, heavy with anticipation. We barely breathed, our ears straining to pick up any sound. And then we heard it. The rumble of tires on gravel, the creaking of suspension, and the murmur of voices. My heart sank and Shelby's grip on my arm quickly tightened. We were trapped with no escape. The truck's headlights cast an eerie glow through the trees, illuminating the darkness like a macabre spotlight. And then, the engine roared so loud I thought it rattled my teeth, plunging us into an even deeper fear. We waited, frozen, as the minutes ticked by. And then the voices started up again, louder this time, and much closer. I still couldn't make them out, but I heard the cadence of a conversation between multiple people. Shelby's whisper was barely audible. "We do." As we huddled together, waiting to see what would happen next, the spotlight pierced the darkness far off in the trees. Then a pair of headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the abandoned camping area. An old dingy truck with a spotlight mounted to the cab rolled into view, lighting up each campsite one by one. The occupants were hollering this crazy nonsense into the trees, their voice echoing throughout the entire forest. My stomach twisted in a sick knot as the spotlight landed on our campsite. The people in the truck went berserk, honking the horn, yelling and screaming. I pushed Shelby down, whispering to her to stay hidden and stay down. If anything happens, get in the truck, lock the doors, and drive away. "What?" she responded in a panic. My instructions were short and ominous, but I didn't have time to explain. If anything got dangerous, her only option was to peel out and leave, go get help somewhere else. I stepped around the truck and tried to address the chaos. "What do you people want?" I shouted over. The response was immediate. Multiple men, all seemingly drunk or high, poured out of that truck and surrounded me. "You paid for your campsite fees," one slurred, his eyes glassy. "You register with the camp keepers?" "Huh?" was all I could muster. Their question legitimately caught me off guard. "Who said you could camp here? You gotta pay your fees," they repeated. By now, I could smell the beer and whiskey rolling off of all these guys, could see the unsure nature of their footing. There wasn't a semblance of reason or sobriety amongst these dudes, just drunk, troublemaking forest folk. Probably lived nearby and spent their free time razzing weekend visitors and out-of-towners. "The area is abandoned, the gate was wide open, I don't have to pay a fee," I explained. "Oh, you make the rules," one of them cut me off. "Hey guys, this asshole's in charge here." They all began to whoop and holler again, and at this point, I began to get agitated. I was just confused, thinking they were affiliated with the campground somehow, but as I looked around the abandoned buildings and overgrown grounds, these people had to be pulling some kind of scam. "I've radioed dispatch," I lied quickly. "The Forest Service is en route." And why shouldn't I lie? These guys were pulling their own little scams, so the only reasonable action was to pull one of my own. Truth be damned. I wasn't about to be bullied out of my campsite, and I damn sure wasn't going to fork over any cash just to be left alone. If push came to shove, these assholes were going to get knocked down a peg. The response was a beer can hurled at my face, hitting me square in the eye. I stumbled back, clutching my face, as the truck roared off into the darkness. For the rest of the night, we heard them ripping around the mountainside, their laughter and shouts echoing through the trees. My face swelled up a lot, as that beer can they threw at me was full and unopened. Just a round weight blasting me right in the orbital bone. Lucky for me, it didn't break. It just turned my eye black the next morning. When I went back to Shelby, I found her shock white. But we weren't dead, so she returned to normal after no time at all. We stoked the fire again to allow some kind of comfort. We were too afraid to sleep in the tent that night, fearing they'd come back and drive right through our camp. The next morning, everything seemed normal. We found a pile of empty beer cans somewhere between the trees, only 30 feet from the campsite. It was clear these weirdos from the last night had been watching us, closely too. As we packed up our gear, Shelby turned to me, her eyes still wide with fear. "I cannot believe what happened last night. I'm really sorry about your eye," she offered. I nodded and said thanks. I think we learned a lesson though. We drove out of that campsite, leaving all the abandoned buildings and the terror of the night behind. The memory of those crazed eyes and the sound of their maniacal laughter would definitely stay with us forever. Hello, my name is Tom, and I want to start out by saying my girlfriend and I are huge fans of your channel. I hope you continue putting out great content for viewers and listeners like us. I'm a traveling contractor electrician, so I've been to just about every state in the country. But often my contracts are only a few weeks to a few months at a time. So when the contracts themselves are finished, I have a lot of downtime between them. One of our favorite activities is traveling, obviously, but also we really love dispersed camping in the most remote parts of the wilderness. We once went through a long stint, like 3 months, just traveling and boondock camping before I took on my next contract. During this time, we experienced many strange happenings, and it definitely gave us plenty of stories to tell. When you're constantly on the road and camping in secluded forest, I suppose you're bound to encounter some unusual people and almost be subjected to some unexplainable events. Like I mentioned before, we got plenty of stories from our travels, but this one particular story is absolutely the most chilling. It still burns deep in our membranes to this day. I still get goosebumps when I tell people this story. The following is a true story that happened to us while we were remote camping on the western side of Alabama at a campground that I will keep anonymous. The year was 2020, and as you can imagine, it wasn't the best time to be searching for places to camp. COVID had caused a lot of businesses to close, as well as campgrounds. In fact, on this night, we ended up stumbling upon this campground because 2 other campgrounds in that area were already closed. It was already after 2 a.m. We struck out all night finding a place to camp. But fortunately, we found this place on Google that was supposedly only 20 minutes away. We enter the sleepy small town that encompasses this hidden gem of a campground. The streets were gloomy, houses were dark. It just had that ominous vibe to it. We come to a long rounded road that encircled a lake. It also looked like a power plant that sat on the shore of the road. We continued down that road until we reached the gates of the park. And to our surprise, the gates were already open. As I previously mentioned, it was hard to find an open campground due to the pandemic. We excitedly entered and began looking for an open spot to camp. At the entrance gate, there was a bathroom, which is a trailer, and it appeared on my driver's side. The door was closed and the lights were off. This park, along with the town, was just empty darkness. The park was a camping area that consisted of 2 loops. The larger, main loop appeared to be for just RVS. The smaller loop appeared to be just for tent camping. As we drove through that main loop, we noticed that there were 0 occupants, nobody. The weather was nice and the camping was free. The park was beautiful. Those camp spots were out on the lake. It was just nice. We were confused, but weren't going to complain about not having anybody else there and having it all to ourselves. We circled the entire park to check out all the spots before driving through the main loop once more. Because it was so late and the town was so small, we weren't really able to find any places to eat. So this, of course, led to a hungry conversation as we pulled into a concrete slab. As we bickered back and forth about this dilemma, it starts downpouring out of nowhere, like legit microbus storm that you would experience while hiking in the canyons of Utah. We continued arguing about what to eat, all while our windshield got pummeled with raindrops. Then after a few minutes, it just stopped. It doesn't even turn into a sprinkle, it just completely stopped. I tell my girlfriend let's loop around the park back to the entrance, see if we can find food in town, and then return to get some rest. We begin to exit the park, but the tension is still high and the unpleasant words are still being exchanged. On our passenger side, we see an off-route dirt path that we assume leads out of the park. As we come off that dirt path, we realize that we're now driving back on pavement. Only, the park gates are in the rearview mirror, and the houses are the same houses we saw upon entering the park, Now the car goes eerily silent, as the conversation between both of us has come to an abrupt halt. I was almost certain there was only one way in and one way out of the park. In my head, I'm starting to mull over the rational possibilities for how we just went out of the park gate, when the park was just a loop with one entrance and one exit. I thought maybe I was just really tired. It was a good excuse, if any. How did we not notice that dirt path the first time that we drove through the campground, though? I start to express my confusion to my girlfriend, and to my horror, she echoes the same thoughts, even baseless accusations that I must have slipped or something. We now decide to turn around and enter the park again, to confirm that there really was some dirt path that led out of the park, and we weren't both just crazy. Now, upon entering the park again, we start to notice some unsettling views that we both agree weren't there before. The restroom trailer that was at the front gate is now lit, with the door hanging open. That was weird. We both thought this was not the case just a few minutes earlier. As we continue through the main loop, searching for that dirt path that we saw, we see the smaller loop that's for the tent camping off to the right, which was the passenger side window. On this unattended campsite, there's a full-blown fire going, ablaze in the fire pit. Didn't it just pour down something fierce and nobody else is here? How is that possible? I ask myself again. My girlfriend acknowledges, and we're in agreement that it's creepy and obviously impossible. But by now, we're both starting to get spooked out. We still want to confirm that there's two ways out of this haunted park. We continue driving through that main loop and past that concrete slab that we briefly parked at minutes before, and both beam our eyes towards the passenger side window to see if that dirt path is still there, the one that led us out of the park that first time. And to both of our utter dismay, nothing was there. Now we're both totally confused and totally spooked. As crazy as it sounds, it felt like some kind of Native American energy. It just scared us right out of the only spot we had to camp at that was within 60 miles. We continued driving through that loop until we hit the entrance gate. Now we had nowhere to camp, but we weren't about to stay here for another second longer. We sped, or rather hightailed it, around that long rounded road that encircled a lake with the power plant. As I gave one last nervous look through the rearview mirror at the entrance gate. Whatever that was, whatever just happened, we wanted no part of it. The next day we went to do some research of our own. The river that surrounded the park was actually a river that bordered the Choctaw land. This land was the land where some of the Indian removal occurred back in the 1830s. As I mentioned at the start of my story, this was only one of our many strange happenings that occurred to us during our boondocking excursions. Stay safe out there, travelers.